Okay, so we are recording. For those of you watching, to give you a bit of context, it's been about 3 or 4 days since the US election. I have an amazing guest for you who can talk to us very much about it, Mark Sutton. So I guess first question, what the hell is going on? It's crazy. What's happened?
Well, there's so many different dynamics that are happening with the election, and my focus has really been on male voters for a long time. And I wrote a book on it this year called How Democrats Can Win Back Men. So just to give you a little background on where I'm coming from and my perspective, because I think that's important. As I wrote this book and I was trying to decide, hey, do I want to write this as a Democrat or do I want to try to be an independent researcher? And I just thought, I care so passionately about these issues. I'm so involved with it. I can't just be a neutral observer. I just have to give my voice to who I am. So my voice is that I've been a registered Democrat for 35 years, and I'm really, really frustrated with the fact that the Democrats have ignored the issues that men and boys are facing, very legitimate issues that they pretend to care about overall, but never really focus on what's going on with men and boys. And then they're shocked that there's been a gender gap since 1980 with men voting much more Republican and women voting much more Democrat. And, in my book, one of the things I talk about, this isn't new. This didn't just pop up. It popped up in 1980 and has been pretty consistent ever since. And in fact, I've got a section in the book where I quote you, by the way, from one of your earlier media appearances about all the people over the years who said there's a gender gap and Democrats have a men problem. This is not something that just popped up in 2024. This has been going on for 40 years. And so, so the first thing to understand is this didn't just happen. The thing that happened this year it is different from previous years. Democrats had already lost most men, especially in the older gaps, have always leaned Republican for these last 40 years. The change this year was the young men, how the young men moved over. I wasn't super surprised by that because when you're ignoring all men and boys, and all their issues, and it's like, okay, you've lost all these. Oh, this year, just this last group kind of slid over a few percentage points to the right, and nobody, that shouldn't be shocking. I was a little surprised at the women's vote was less Democratic than I thought too, which is kind of brings up some other issues. But my real focus is on the male half because still, even with this shift, women voted. The early exit polls indicate that women voted more or less plus 10 for Democrat, a little lower than they thought, but still, that's pretty heavily Democrat. Like if all women, Democrats would have won in a landslide, right? But with men, it was the exact opposite. Men were about plus 10 for Trump and the Republicans, right? So you can see, even though people would say, oh, women didn't do as much, there's a 20-point or so gender gap there, which is pretty similar to 2020, which is pretty similar to 2016. So this gap has been around for a while. So why don't the Democratic strategists say, hey, let's try to pull the men up just even halfway, just even part way of that gap? If they could even if they could break even among men, if they had broke even among men this election, they would have won in a landslide. But they simply refused. And, it was mind-boggling because there were so many opportunities. And I don't just blame the Harris candidacy, because she did inherit it pretty late. She inherited it in July, and she didn't do anything better than Biden had done. But, I also place a lot of the blame on the Biden administration. And let me say this too, I've got a lot of respect for a lot of people in the Democratic Party, a lot of respect for President Joe Biden, for Vice President Harris. I think they're good people. I think they mean well. I think that a lot of their policies are actually good. 50% of the problem was in messaging. The other 50% was like shifting at policies. But, let me just go through, a few of the major times that the Democrats just completely dropped the ball. Okay, so when you understand a key to the election is getting a certain number of male votes, they're roughly half the voter base, right? So keep that in mind. You're saying we want to get as many votes as possible. Half the people are men. Here are some of the ways that they didn't talk to them at all. In the State of the Union address, that's the biggest speech of the year for President Biden. He didn't mention anything for men and boys. I had suggested he talk about, there was a bill in Congress from Representative Payne from New Jersey, the Men's Health Awareness and Improvement Act, which is perfect, all set. It's already been written. All he had to do was even suggest the Democrats support it, even if the bill never passed. It was free. It's like no political capital loss. You've got a representative from New Jersey who had written the bill. It was right there. All he has to do is say, "This is a great bill," and he could have pointed to the representative. The representative stands up. Everyone claps. Boom. Get on with the rest of the address. What a perfect opportunity he would have had. And even if the bill didn't get passed, he could say, "Hey, we're trying." Right? It was free. It was free marketing toward the men and boys who you need to win, and they would just refuse to do it. And it was incredibly ironic that, unfortunately, a few weeks after that address, Representative Payne passed away at the age of 65. Incredibly tragic. And, in the White House press briefing, this guy started the Congressional Men's Health Caucus. What a great group. Like, this is probably the least controversial issue. And sometimes people get into men and boys issues. They're like, family courts or stuff. Maybe there's something a little I don't agree with. I mean, men's health. Men are dying 5.9 years earlier than women. So, of course, just suggesting, hey, let's just try to help out, prostate cancer screening, suicide prevention, just some real basic things. I don't think I'd be shocked if somebody really said, I was going to vote for Harris, but then, they had suggested a men's health initiative, and I can't do it. I'm going to vote for Trump instead. I mean, would they lose a single vote in the entire country over that? I don't think so. I don't think they would lose a single. Yeah.
Well, do you think it's quite a cynical view from Harris and her team that didn't talk about it? It sounds like that's a home run waiting to be hit. So what, the men's health bill, the man leading that, he passed away himself from early death. That could have been such an easy win to bring that up, but they didn't. And is that because, why not? I don't understand why they would not.
I don't know. I wrote letters. I wrote emails. I wrote a book. I wrote a blog. I went on interviews. I talked to people in the party. I flew out to Washington, D.C. on my own dime. I spoke to members on the party. I would talk to, people in staffers' offices in Washington, D.C. I called people I know all over the country in the party. I did everything I possibly could. So I kind of am upset that it didn't get more traction this year, but I'm hopeful that with this election, this is a wake-up call. Once you've lost the White House, the Supreme Court, the Senate, and most likely when it's all said and done, they're probably going to lose the House. I'm just assuming they are because everything is going so badly. I don't see it. I don't see it shifting. So, when you've lost everything, isn't it time to regroup? Okay, who's 50% of the population that we have, for some reason, decided we can't do anything for? Hey, maybe we should try this. So that's what I'm hoping that the Democrats will do. And I want to get involved with the party and do that. That's my goal.
I'm totally on board with you. I mean, I did not want Donald Trump to win either. But if there is a silver lining, it's surely that this could actually finally be the wake-up call the Democrats need to be like, there's 50% of the electorate that you're not even doing anything for. Why not do something for them? Do you think that this might actually be the straw that broke the camel's back? Although it is a big straw, it could well do it.
I really hope it is. I really hope it is. And, one of the ideas I came up in my book I call it the Democratic disconnect, because I've had this, and I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. I've had this conversation so many times, even on election night. Here's an example of what I call the Democratic disconnect, like in action. So I'm standing outside this left-wing bookstore where I did my book launch called Manny's in San Francisco. Really cool place. In fact, 2 weeks before my book launch, Vice President Harris did a talk in that exact same room. So it's like a really cool spot, right? And so I'm standing outside. There's a woman. She's wearing a cat on her head, and she's got a T-shirt about women and voting and stuff like that, which is great, awesome, support it 100%. Because she was making fun of the single cat lady thing. That was her costume. So, okay, great. And she's obviously pumped for Harris. We're in Harris's hometown, where she's from. Like, okay, everyone's, super pumped. And she wrote a book on women's suffrage. I'm like, oh, this is great. And she asked me, like, what do you do? Oh, I wrote a book on men and the Democrats and how the Democrats need to win back men or they might lose the election. And then she just didn't respond well to the message. She said, I don't think, and this is what I've heard countless times. Not everyone. There's some people who don't feel this way, but there are a certain percentage of Democrats who feel that until all of women's issues are fixed, we shouldn't really start looking at men's issues. And I think that is, and the fact is, it is not a zero-sum game. We can, and the way I like to say it is, we can support multiple groups of people at the same time in meaningful ways.
But you asked earlier, you question that you wouldn't lose a single vote if you talked about men's health as a Democrat. But those people you just mentioned that seem to think that we shouldn't talk about men's issues until women's are solved, surely those are the people that you potentially would lose their vote. So do you think there would actually be people that would not vote for the Democrats purely on the basis if they talked about men's health?
So I think people with that kind of attitude, I think they might not like the fact that men's health is talked about, but I mean, are they going to vote for Jill Stein and the Green Party at the last second? I don't think so. And I mean, that's part of what political parties do. They have to compromise. I mean, the idea of the Democratic Party, they say they want a big tent. So maybe if you're going to have a big tent, you should also address all the people in the tent and let all the people in the tent speak and have their values understood. And, you know, at the end of the day, there's going to be compromise. I mean, there's going to be, we have a joke in San Francisco, because it's one of the most liberal cities, you know, in the world, certainly in the United States, that there's two parties, the far left progressive Democrats and the moderate Democrats. Because there's, you know, so few Republicans in the city. Like the city council is all Democrat, 100%. But there's two wings of the Democratic Party represented. So in some sense, you know, I guess I would consider myself more of that moderate Democrat Party and less of the far left progressive. And I think that's where that democratic disconnect that I talked to is stronger. And I should also say, you know, again, as a moderate, I've got a lot of friends who are more conservative, who are more Republican, and I get along with them well as people. I think, you know, every party is going to have extremists and have some bad messaging out there, but most people aren't like that. Most people are good people, and a lot of Republicans who actually care about men and boys are doing a better job of messaging. And again, that's why I think that's it's not the only reason, but I think it's a big part of the reason that the Republicans won this election.
So why do you think we're so, especially in America, why do you think we're so unwilling to talk to people that are even slightly politically different to us? I mean, I did a post the other day on Instagram about Kamala Harris losing, and people were talking about pro-life, pro-choice in my comments. And I remember seeing a comment that was like, oh, great, pro-life people are here. What a surprise. And I'm like, well, nearly half of Americans are pro-life. And like, we're a better place to speak to them than right here. I'm pro-choice, but I would still speak to someone that's pro-life. And I suppose I'm seeing the same divisive rhetoric within that same debate, where the pro-choice are dividing themselves by men and women, where half of pro-choice are blaming the men. And I'm like, well, men are just as often pro-choice as women, broadly speaking, in America. And this is the divisive politics I see at the center of the far left, that is alienating themselves, almost like punching themselves in the face. They've lost women's reproductive rights as a consequence, and now they've lost the election. Right. And I'm like, how important is this man hating to you? How many elections do you want to lose before you bring these men on side and actually validate them as having significant issues? So going back to your men's health point, really important, probably the most pressing of all the issues, especially if it encompassing male suicide, but men's health in America, awful. So we're talking about worse health in every single group, every single racial, ethnic, socioeconomic group. Men are behind in health. If you wrote down the top 15 causes of death in America, men are leading in 13 of them. So more or less a full house. I think 1.5 or 1.6 times more likely to die than women, and die more often in every single age group, from early years right through to old age. Like, it's all bad. There are, I think, 7 or 8, might even be 9 different offices, federal offices, to support women's health in America, which is a wonderful thing. 8.
Yeah, there's 8 offices of women's health. And I analyze this in the book. In the appendix of my book, I go through the 8 and look at their the budgets for those 8. Another example of the Democratic disconnect and a missed opportunity for the Democrats. So President Biden has something called the White House Gender Policy Council, which sounds very gender neutral, but is in fact anything but. Its mission is specifically to focus on the needs of women and girls. And guess what? They recommended $600 million additional funding for women and girls' health. Now, again, we want to support women and girls, and that's great. And if there has been traditionally, before the past, 30, 40 years in particular, a gap where we weren't properly studying women for various reasons, the effect of medication on women maybe wasn't studied because they were scared that if they gave women medication, it would affect them worse. So anyway, there's a whole history of why that happened. But be that as it may, great. I 100% agree that we should make sure that the research for women and girls is proper and is the correct amount. But at the same time, men are the ones dying 5.9 years earlier. And I think that's a legitimate thing. Even Harvard Magazine came out with it. And they said, we need to study this more. We don't know why this gap keeps increasing. Of course, men were more likely to die of COVID, or are still more likely to die of COVID-19 as well. And a lot of people just don't know that. So it's been, it is a little bit of an uphill battle. But those offices of women's health started in the 1980s. They've sort of been gradually built up since then. So, and those are great. I'm not saying we should get rid of those. Let's just have one for men now that we see that there's this life expectancy gap among other things. It's not just one thing. People say, oh, well, maybe it's just, men are not taking care of themselves, or it's their own fault. If women were dying 6 years earlier, would we say it's women's fault for not doing something? We wouldn't blame them, right? We would say, let's support you, right?
I find it very frustrating because I work in the creative industry. And one of my clients is the National Health Service in the UK. And one of the campaigns I worked on was targeting different socioeconomic and ethnic groups to help them get vaccinated, to help them take their health more seriously. So like Black and South Indian populations in the UK are quite hesitant around healthcare, like men. And they're also at risk of COVID as well, just like men. In fact, less at risk than men. And it was very frustrating for me being asked to help Black and Indian populations, but not men. And I was just like, it's the same naivety, it's the same fingers and ears, head buried in the sand. And I don't agree. I don't understand why you say people want to solve all women's issues before they look at men's. And I just said, well, men are leading in 13 of the top 15 causes of death. Are those people waiting for 15 out of 15? Like, I don't understand, what are we waiting for?
Yeah. And I don't totally understand it, but I think there is this false belief that all men have always had all the privilege. Yeah. And, I think this gets into something called the apex fallacy, where the fact that all presidents have been men, and that's true, and men are overrepresented in leadership position, you could say, 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs and 75% of the U.S. Congress. But that doesn't mean that all men have always had power, that men and boys don't have any issues that as a group deserve to be heard. So, I mean, homelessness is one of those. The Coalition on Homelessness in the U.S. said this is a gendered issue and it's mostly men who are affected. And I would say this, just think about a homeless man living in a tent underneath the I-80 bridge in Oakland or something. You go up and say, well, you should feel empowered because Joe Biden is the president and he happens to be the same biological sex as you. So I don't know what you're complaining about. It's irrelevant to his current situation. If you look through history, the rights of workers, like look at miners. I don't know if you've seen these photos of miners. They would go stuck in these little elevators, go down a kilometer underneath ground in the pitch dark and work in horrible conditions and die at young ages from black lung disease. What part of that is privilege? What part of the Bataan Death March in the Philippines in 1941 is privilege? Like, how is an 18-year-old being drafted off of a farm to the army, sent across the world and marched to his death? How is that considered privilege?
And that's one of the frustrations I found with Kamala Harris when she was asked on that podcast, are there any laws that remove a man's bodily autonomy, like a woman's autonomy has been removed? And she laughed and was like, no. And I'm like, every single man in America has to, at their 18th birthday, sign up for the draft. They're signing their entire body away to the state. And the government has complete control of their body and can send them to their death, and have done, like in Vietnam, I think 17,000 men died in that war, draftees. And it was so frustrating to see Kamala say the government doesn't have legislative power over a man's body, when clearly they do, in the worst possible way. So do you think that's the sort of thing that would frustrate male voters?
Absolutely. And again, I guess the word that I like to use too is balance. The Democratic Party is out of balance on these issues. And so that's why when people say, oh, are you saying we shouldn't talk about women and girls? No, absolutely, of course. I mean, I've got tons of women in my life who I love. And of course, I want the world to be the best place for them. That's one of the reasons I've been a registered Democrat for 35 years. That, I am pro-choice, for instance. That's something I believe in. And so I've been, supporting women in that way for 35 years. And now I think it's just time to say, well, hey, let's just balance this a little bit more. Like you say, if you look at, let's just a few more missed opportunities, this year. The Democratic National Platform, the Democratic Party platform, they have all these issues for women and girls, which are great, but then they completely ignore the issues of men and boys. I'm a data guy, I'm a data analyst. So I looked at I did a word count in there. It was 82-4 in terms of, so the word women appears 82 times in the document and the word men appears only 4 times in the document. So you don't need to even do much more analysis than that. I mean, just at that really basic level, you can say, oh, the Democratic Party cares about, women's issues, and they don't focus on men's issues. They have made that very clear. So if you were going canvassing door to door and you're trying to advocate for the Democratic Party and someone said, well, what are you doing for men? You'd have to say, well, economic issues we think our economic policy is better. Okay, but that's good for everyone. And that's good. And that's important, right? Inflation matters to everyone. Employment matters to everyone. Those things are important. And, part of it is messaging. I think the Democratic Party, a lot, and I talk about this in the book, a lot of the issues that the Democrats could focus on male well-being are already part of their core values. They just don't frame it that way. And those are the easiest ones to flip, right? Universal health care, again, so going back to men's health, universal health care, men are actually less likely to be covered in the United States. So the group that's dying early has less likely to be covered. And then you don't use this as hey, men, we want you to have universal health care so that you'll all be covered so that you'll live longer. Then you can be around for your family. That's why not message that to men? They just don't do that. It's very simple.
It's interesting. Yeah, I've noticed this phenomenon too, where we don't seem to gender men's issues. We talk about them and care about them, but they're sort of categorized elsewhere. So like homelessness, I'd argue, is a gendered issue in many ways because it's like 70-80% men. In the UK, it's nearly 90% men who die on the streets. I'd say if you're anti-homelessness, you are actually a men's advocate. I'd say if you're anti-war, for example, as I am, you're a men's advocate because it's almost all people who die in war are men. Even like most recently, Black Lives Matter. If you're against police brutality, you're a men's advocate because 95-96% of people killed by police in America are men. If you were to line up all the last 100 Black Americans killed by police, about 99% of them would be men. So I'm like, you're actually an accidental advocate, I call them. And right. You just don't call it that.
Yeah, and why not just reframe it? So I think the easiest thing to do is exactly what you were just saying. Let's just reframe some of these issues. And another one related to that is the prison industrial complex, or also referred to as mass incarceration. So there are absolutely racial inequities in this. Absolutely. There's no question. If you look at the incarceration rates for Black men versus white men, for instance, it's much higher. But if you look at all men versus all women, or even if you look at the incarceration rate for Black women versus white men are still much more likely to be incarcerated. So if you consider that a bad social outcome, I would say that let's look at this in terms of male well-being and social outcomes. I also come from a community development finance space. So we work with nonprofits that help low-income communities. And, again, in that space, in the nonprofit space, you will often see when they do data, oh, we helped so many people find affordable housing, X number of people. And of those, X percent were women. Mm. And so they will brag about the number of women they helped, but they won't brag about the number of men they helped. But that's the sort of thing we see all over the place. Yeah.
But we see that all the time. Like so many issues like BLM, for example. I remember going on their website, the actual organization, Black Lives Matter, they only have targeted policy for Black women. And it really confuses me. In the UK, I'm a big advocate of prison reform. The Labour government have just come in. They've announced some prison reform to basically close as many prisons as possible because most people shouldn't be in there, and I agree. But they've only done it for women in prison, and I'm like, that's like 4%. I'm like, so even when there's an issue that does disproportionately impact men, like prison or BLM, when people talk about it in a gendered way, it's the opposite. It's like, how could that make sense?
Yeah, it makes me pull my hair out sometimes. Yeah,
and it's why it's so frustrating to be left wing because these are all things I care about and I agree with. But then I always think about it a bit like when I went to watch my local football team play, but I had to sit in the away end because I couldn't get a ticket. And it's like, we all love football here, but I feel like I'm not welcome. And it's not really about everyone saying something different to me. I'm cheering on my team, but everyone else around me is cheering the opposite team. And it's bewildering and confusing and very disheartening.
Yeah, the initial title for my book, and I still call the intro of the book this, was A Man Without a Party. Because I felt like what you were saying, it among Democratic circles, I say it's starting to shift. You asked me earlier, is there a shift? Do you think this is the point? I do think we are at an inflection point. I actually do, which is heartening. But, typically when I speak about, male well-being, and that's how I focus is male well-being. Do you care? It's about that, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is all about well-being. You can speak about that. You can speak about that to men and boys and not be a Republican or on the political right. And when I speak with Bryce, sometimes I speak with these Asian people, the political right, like, Mark, it's great that you understand these. Why aren't you a Republican? I said, well, I care more about the environment. I also do care. I am pro-choice. There's a lot of issues with the Democratic Party that I do line up for. But we've lost 73% of wildlife, in the last 50 years or some crazy number like that. At least the Democrats are trying to address that. It didn't really, unfortunately, come up very much, this issue. Of course, there's the issue of global warming. But, this brings another example of framing and messaging. Sperm counts for men have been declining and have declined over 50% in the last 50 years. In fact, a recent study from Israel came out saying over 60% globally. This is not in just one country or one little town where they're next to a factory everywhere. There was a study this spring that said, these microplastics are in our, private parts. Okay. They found that. And everywhere, all around every single sample they studied, they found this. So this is not a question of, there's a little bit of pollution here. This is affecting men. 10% of men now need to seek fertility treatment. They have a hard time having kids. And so, again, why couldn't the Democratic Party message this as part of their family platform? They did. This is one. Okay, I'll give them a little bit of credit. One of the few things they talked about this year, because there were a couple, so I've been harsh on them. Let me give them a little credit when they deserve it. Governor Tim Walz, I'm a native of the state of Minnesota, where Governor Tim Walz is. That's where he serves. But he talked about how he used IVF to have his kids. His daughter was named Hope because they needed to use these fertility treatments, and he and his wife. Now, we don't know exactly which treatment they used or why they needed it or whatever. But the point is, there's a family. They've already got 2 kids, but they want one more, and so they use this treatment, and it's for the whole family. It's not just a women's issue. It's not just a men's issue. It's a family issue. It's for everyone. And so I like that in that statement they were very inclusive. And I think that's the sort of thing they need to do more of too, is also in issues that are inclusive, then just be inclusive about men. Use the male statistic along with the female, because it's also about 10% of women who need to seek fertility treatment. So it's about the same. So, hey, we're all in this together. We're all having, of course, biology for men and women is different. That's basically the difference between men and women, right? It's biology.
Yeah.
So, let's talk about this. So at least they talked about IVF a little bit. They didn't talk about broader reproductive rights for men, like the right to not father a child if you don't want to, or things like that. And that gets into some of that's why I say those are the more controversial issues. I wouldn't expect them to talk about a paper abortion at the DNC. That I was not expecting.
If I were advising whoever runs the Democrats, the things like paper abortion, I'd be like, you know what, put that down. I mean, it's an important issue, but put that down, for maybe the 2030s, because that is it's hot, but I don't necessarily think it should be. And if people are wondering what that is, it basically gives a man the right to opt out of parenthood as long as the mother's made aware before she gives birth. And it's basically the same. This is why it's confusing for me, because I am pro-choice, but I also I think we should discuss the ability for a man to opt out. Like, why can a man not make that same decision? Like, if a woman's making a unilateral decision to keep or not keep a child, which is her right, why can a man not make his own unilateral decision to be like, I actually don't want to be a father? And I agree. Let's not open that kind of worms, because it's a controversial, a highly controversial one.
That one is controversial. Maybe even another controversial one in that same arena, though. But the one that I think is fascinating and that will be developing soon is the whole idea of paternal identification, because Now with DNA testing, we know who the father is, and the laws have not caught up to the DNA. And unfortunately, this whole concept of the fact that sometimes, the father is not who we think, it's been exploited by daytime talk shows. I don't know if you have this in the UK, but we have it here in the US where they do the gender reveal. So they have, they have a guy come out, they have a woman, and she's like, "You're the father." And she brings a picture of the baby. "Look, you look just like him." And then they have a big reveal. And then if it's the father, everyone points at the guy and boos, and then they make up. And then if he's not the father, he brags and she runs back. I mean, it's so sad that this is a child's life we're talking about, and who are this child's parents? And it's so sad that it gets treated in that carnival type atmosphere. It's such an important topic, and it's a real child's issue as well. And this is where, again, a lot of times it's about balance and about understanding that these issues apply to multiple groups of people. So, if you talk to children, they want to know who their biological parents are. It's a natural thing. And maybe this is this is a challenging issue because, you're getting into privacy rights, issues like that. Should it be forced that you have to have a DNA test when you're born? Is that invasive? Is that government overreach, like getting into your private life? But at the same time, don't the potential father and the child have a right to know, okay, whose actual biological child is this? There's medical reasons for the child. And in addition to the emotional reasons and spiritual reasons, there's also medical reasons. Oh, my father has this medical condition, and that means I'm at high risk for this. I should live my life in a way to prevent that so that I know that that's happening. Nobody wants to have some sort of confrontation with a young baby in there. Everyone's smiling, everyone's happy. Nobody wants to, bring that. It's a challenging subject, but 10 years, 20 years down the line, you hear, "Mom, my whole life's been a lie. I didn't know this guy." And anyone involved in the story, if the child's is not the child of the biological they think it is, it's a really challenging thing. So anyway, I understand this one is very controversial, and I would not put this first. Like I'd put some of these other like men's health, environment issues, and more simple issues like family court ahead of this. But it's a fascinating issue, especially because of the DNA aspect. Because kids are going to go online, they're going to figure it out anyway. Because that's happening with sperm donors now. If you donated sperm 30 years ago, your kids are going to find out who you are.
Well, I mean, I'm not as afraid of controversial issues as the Democrat Party, so I'm more than happy to speak about it. And unfortunately, like most things, we import your TV as well. So I also get to see those horrendous TV shows where basically dads are finding out their child who they raised 5, 10 years or more actually aren't even their children. And of all the horrible things, upsetting things I get sent, they are definitely right at the top. And I can't imagine anything worse than finding out your child is not actually your child and you've been basically raising someone else's child. And people like to see it as like, it's a lightning strike if it doesn't happen that often. But the data is very difficult to understand. But the best guess is about 1 in 25, I think it is. 1 in 25 dads in America is raising a child he thinks is his, but it actually is not his. And if you scale that up to the amount of dads in America, that's like millions. That's like millions and millions of dads. And that is a massive problem. And that is a failure of reproductive rights for that man. But going back to fertility issues, I mean, it's something I've spoken about a little bit as well, where men are half of all infertility issues. So it's a problem with the man. And I looked into the UK, only 2.5% of reproductive specialists are male reproductive specialists or specialists of the male reproduction. And I don't think people knows what a gynecologist is. I don't think anyone on this podcast knows what a male reproductive specialist is called. Do you know what it's called? Do you want the name of a?
Is it different than just a urologist?
Yeah, it was an andrologist.
Andrologist. Okay, I didn't even know that.
Exactly. People say we don't take women's reproductive health seriously, and yeah, I don't think we do. But at least we know what they're called. And yeah, andrologist is just something that no one knows about. So
thank you for educating me on that.
Well,
I learned a new word today. That's great.
That's my job. Yep. And also, like people that I know that I've sought help for men fertility wise, they have to go and see a gynecologist, and they're not trained on men's reproductive systems. Anyway, getting back into the election. I mean, I've read some crazy headlines recently. I mean, I've read like how racist and sexist America is, and they will not elect a female president. but I also read stats on it, thankfully. And I read a survey by the General Social Survey, which goes right back to 2010, and they found that 96% of Americans surveyed are totally supportive of a female president. And that was 14 years ago. And they never asked the question again because they were just like, what's the point? Like, this is settled. So you more or less could say 100% by now. So if it isn't sexism that is stopping people from voting Kamala, when a man goes into the ballot box, in simple terms, why is he not ticking the Democrat box?
I don't know if it's simple. A lot of men feel on a gut level that the Democratic Party just doesn't care for them. Now, I don't think that the average Democratic voter went and did a word count in the Democratic platform like I did, right? Yeah. I don't think so. I don't think, I also analyzed the websites, everything from the Democratic Party website to state level websites to individual. You see the same pattern. There's going to be a section for women's issues. There's going to be drop-down menus for women's issues. You're not going to see that for men and boys issues. You hear it in the speeches, right? So even if you don't do an analysis, if you just are just sort of paying somewhat of attention and hearing what you hear, you're like, they never talk about me. They never talk about my issue. They don't need to do a word count. They just sense that. And I think, and again, it's not like there were no men who voted for Harris. I mean, it was a 10% gender gap. That means 45% to 55%. So we're not it's not like there's no men at all who are supportive of women and girls. And that's another thing. I mean, look at the history. So I have a graph going back to 1972, just looking at the gender gap, which one thing about the gender gap too, it's all based on exit polls. So the data is always a little bit fuzzy, and statisticians, as statistics, we can argue in the background. I think the number is a little higher, a little lower. But, generally speaking, we've had this gap since 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. And in 1984, this is the exact mistake that Democrats made. They were asked, what do you think about the gender gap? And they said, we think we're going to do well enough women to make up for the gap among men, so we're not even going to try. So in 1984, that was the year that my home state of Minnesota was the only state as Democrats won. You know how we have these red and blue maps of the electoral map? That year was only one state right in the middle. Minnesota, it was all red otherwise, and only one blue state. I think they lost men by about 25%. So this time they're only 10. They're actually not that bad. If they can get it up to 4 or 5, they're going to have a chance next time. I mean, they're not that far out of it. It was 25 down. That's how far they had to come back finally by 1992. And then Bill Clinton actually won among men by 3%. And so what did Bill Clinton do? I mean, he somehow appealed better to men. He somehow, was something about him and the way he talked. And he was very popular among women too. So in fact, in 1996, the highest percentage that women have ever voted pro-Democrat was Bill Clinton's second term, 1996. They were at plus 16%.
Well, you've actually worked out the percent that any party needs of men, the Democrats especially, to win. Yeah. And you've got that as the magic number, which is minus 8%. So tell us, what is that? And what does that mean? Why is that so important?
Yeah. So let's talk about this data set. Just looking at how men and women have voted, if men vote more or less Republican or Democrat every year, going back to 1972. And I just went back that far because I think that the whole electorate is more or less turned over since then. And the world is a very different place in the last 50 years. So you could look before that. I haven't looked at the earlier data. But this is a tremendously powerful data set. I know people like to splice and dice, but it's basically a 2x2 data set of all voters, and each set is about 50%. So you got like roughly 50% Republican and 50% Democrat, and roughly 50% men, 50% women. So to look at just those few data points over 50 years, you can see the entire political history of the country in that data set. That's just my favorite data set. And I kind of base my, my book and my theories kind of come from that. And so, as you mentioned, one of the big takeaways, I said, well, how are they doing among men and when they win versus they lose? And if you just draw a line across minus 8%, I call this the magic number. And I'm not calling this Sutton's key to the election. But every time they've been at minus 8 or better, they have won. Every time the Democrats have been less than minus 8 with men, they have lost.
And so where are they this election?
So this election, they were just below that. The early exit poll data is showing minus 10. So they're below the number and they lost. Now, I think the number, this is early exit poll data. The numbers settle in over about the next month or so. We'll have a better, and again, pollsters have different methodologies, and they'll argue this. And this is something I warned about and this is, I know we're getting a little bit into the details about methodology and polling methods, but it's very important because there are going to be some pollsters who find a narrower gap and some who find a wider gap. So if they find a narrower gap, they'll say, oh, you know what? Democrats aren't doing so bad among men. We don't need to worry about them. And I think that's a mistake. It's okay to have a good intellectual conversation about the numbers and exactly where that gap is. But when you've got some, the New York Times ended up showing a wider gap than that. Their polling methodology would show a wider one. Something called Washington Monthly, Bill Scher created something called the Gender Gap Tracker this year for the first time. That was pretty cool. And his final number that he used was minus 8.7. So anyway, there's one more really important thing. So there's that minus 8% number, right, that I mentioned. Democrats just going for it. We got to do at least better than minus 8%. That should be a goal.
So when you say minus 8%, that's 8% less than the number percent of women that vote for that. It
would be, so the 8% is this, take 100 men, it would mean 54 of them voted Republican and 46 of them voted Democrat. So among men, you take the vote, and that's where that minus 8 number comes. Okay. So if 56 men vote Republican and 44 vote Democrat, which is, 12%, that's going to be really, really hard to make up on the female side. And another thing I noticed in this analysis that I think is really important, every single time the Democrats have been in power, when they're the ones in the White House, they lose among men the next election. Like their support among men goes down in the following election. And so last time Joe Biden was about at minus 8%. So it's like, it's probably going to go down to about 10 or 11, just looking at the trends. Because, again, I'm looking at the past. I also say this, just like Wall Street, past performance does not guarantee future return. Any year could be different. And I thought this year maybe was going to be different because I thought maybe the gender gap would be so big because of the abortion issue, but that did not happen. So again, Democrats get into power. They have a party platform that doesn't say anything for men and boys. They don't enact legislation that specifically helps men and boys. That, men don't really feel heard. Again, on the margins, that couple 3-4%, that shift is enough to change the whole election. And so those are a couple of the insights. Again, when you look at the data, just take this really powerful basic data set and look at those numbers, you can just see how vital it is if they could just get a few more percent of men. And then here's what they do. I'm sure you saw this in the last couple months. They're guilty of what I call man washing. So that's kind of like greenwashing. You know what greenwashing is, right? When you're a huge company, you pollute the environment, and the front of your annual report is like a duck in a pond, and oh, look how green we are. We recycle 5% of our paper in our office, but that's greenwashing. Man washing is kind of what I would call the Democratic Party does. And I had a moment of dread when I saw the picture of Tim Walz in the orange hunting vest and the gun. I don't know if you saw that one. There's a picture of him going hunting, and I had flashbacks to John Kerry in 2004. So again, you're not focusing on men and their issues, but here's our candidate with a hunting rifle and an orange vest. Vote for us. That's what they did this year. Again, I have a lot of respect for Tim Walz. I like Tim Walz a lot. There was that beautiful moment with him and his son at the Democratic National Convention when his son stood up and pointed, "That's my dad." It was so sweet. That was a really genuine, beautiful moment. I think it really humanized the whole event. It humanized Tim Walz and the party, and it showed the importance of fatherhood. And again, this was an unscripted moment, but I think it was actually a very powerful and meaningful moment for the Democrats. Even though they lost, I still think it's an important moment for them. That was very, very sweet. But, and again, I like a lot of Tim Walz's policy. I think he's a good guy. But just to say, hey, I'm a football coach, and that's great. He does have these great things about him. A football coach, he's a dad, he's a hunter. He's been in the military himself, in the National Reserve, I believe it was, National Guard. So he does have all this great resume. He was a good picture of, people say, oh, this is, positive masculinity or things like that. Great, that is good. But you have to back it up with substantive policy issues. You can't just say, we're going to ignore you in our platform, but hey, it's a week before the election. Hey, look at this guy. And there, I don't know if you caught it. There was a photo op moment of Harris with Michigan Governor Meg Whitmer drinking a beer. So they did let's go to the bar and have a beer. And then she got caught on a hot mic saying, I need to make up ground among men.
Wow.
And that's why we're doing. I mean, the implication was my understanding. If I understood what she was saying rightly, it's like we're just going to be two people having a beer because that'll look cool and men will vote for us. And I'm just thinking, you've had the whole year to talk about anything. You haven't done it, and now at the last second, you want to have a beer. I literally was like pulling my hair out when I saw this.
But why? Where is the substance? What would happen if Kamala had just stood up on stage and said, "We live in a country where every day a man wakes up, the biggest threat to his life is his own hands, is suicide. That is true every day of his life until he's 50. As the president, as a soon-to-be president, I find that totally unacceptable, and I promise to work X, Y, and Z." What would have actually happened if she said that? What is so harmful? How could anyone find that controversial? And why not just say that? That would have surely won votes.
Yeah. And in fact, the Republicans did just that. They did that sort of thing. So there was a rally. I mean, listen, the Republicans are smart. They're capitalizing on this. They get it. They understand that the Democrats are just kind of dropping the ball here. They saw an opening and they went for it. And, they talked very directly about men. We're going to support you. We're going to be the party for you. I think it was Megyn Kelly, I believe, at one of Trump's rallies near the end. She came out and said, "Men and boys, we're the party for you. Vote for us." I mean, they're just literally saying, "Men, vote for us."
Yeah. Only time I've ever clapped at a Republican crowd. I was at home, obviously. I was like, this is, I'm like, brilliant. Like, I would never vote for them, but I'm like, that is what I want to hear from my side.
Exactly. Copy and paste Kamala, and I'll say this every day for the last month and then put some policies behind it. There was I think Harris did what I would call a Hail Mary pass because I think she was getting data that black men among all men were some of the men who are leading a little bit more Republican. And so she did an opportunity agenda for black men. I'll just say this. I'm not a huge fan of, first of all, there's this, absolutely, there are racial inequities in the United States. No question. And there's no question that black men face the worst challenges, and that's not fair. So I support that. But 2 weeks before the election, to announce an opportunity agenda for black men only that included a health initiative. So that part of it, again, it's like they were starting to get close here at the end. They were kind of getting close. And, economic opportunity. But it was just, like I say, it's like, do you know what I say when I say Hail Mary pass? That's in American football, the last play of the game, you're down by 10. You just throw the ball and just hope maybe we'll get the last point and win. But there's almost no chance. That's what a Hail Mary is for your people who don't know American football. So I think it was a last second shot to try to get a few black male voters. Maybe they got a few black male voters. I don't know.
But I agree. I think the intersection of race and gender is really important, especially in terms of incarceration, police brutality, violent crime, gangs. I think that's important. And I welcome Kamala's addition, but only that needs to be done on top of a broader policy for all men. And then you can build your intersectional gay men, black men, whatever else.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
You're obviously very comfortable, Mark, speaking about the stats, but I'm going to take you a little bit out of your comfort zone. We talked a little bit about like the branding of this, like the image and how important image is. Like you talked about the deer hunting thing. We had a prime minister, Ed Miliband, and his entire campaign got torpedoed because of a photo of him eating a bacon sandwich, and he was eating it in such an odd way that people just no, that is not the prime minister for us. So clearly, image is very important.
Yes, image is absolutely important. Yeah,
and this is such a difficult area of advocacy to sort of navigate. I always think of it like a dance. We're all dancing this dance in this space. We all want to acknowledge women's issues as part of this, but we don't want to make men's issues like some sort of supplement to women's issues. So we don't want to like distract from women, but we also want to have an equally important conversation about men. We want to talk about both, and we don't undermine ourselves. And we're all dancing this dance, trying to get it right. I'm dancing one way, Richard Reeves is dancing another. You've got your own dance going on. And like you literally wrote the book on this. Like your book is literally called How Democrats Can Win Back Men. So like, what is the dance? How do we talk about these issues realistically? Because you're not going to get Kamala or whoever comes next, being some sort of manosphere, being part of manosphere. Like it has to be realistic. But what does it actually look like? Like how do the Democrats win back men? Like what does it actually look like?
there's just no question in my mind that there's kind of two halves to this. I think the first is this will help you win. Do you want to win? Because there are some people who more or less, sometimes I talk to this and people just go to those -8%, the magic number. They just, okay, how do we get this number? What's the best way to get this number? Is this number guaranteed? They want to know the numbers. And some people who, work on these campaigns, it's sort of like conversion for, any other sort of sales. Anyway, and then the second part of it is, but then you also have to have the policies behind it. So anyone who cares about this, even if you care more about the numbers, you have to understand you're not going to get the numbers till you're backing it up with policy. But that's a good thing for everyone because we're all interconnected. And if men's and boys' social outcomes are worse, we haven't even talked about education, how boys are falling out of school, dropping out of school. They're only 40%. Men are only 40% of college students now, and the number that keeps going. They're only 40% of college students, by the way. There is affirmative action in favor of men to keep it at 40. It would be even less than that if there weren't affirmative action. People don't really know that. So when people say, is there affirmative action for men? There actually is in colleges and universities. One person from a university said, yeah, we'd be at about a third men if we didn't,
Wow.
And then men drop out at higher rates too. So how to get started with the Democrats, how to get this message out. I think the first thing is just understanding there's the two sides of it. There's the horse race angle of it, like this is going to help you win, but also there is the societal angle. This is going to be better for society. It's going to be better for everyone if men and boys' social outcomes are better. So anyway, I just wish that anyone who cares about the Democratic Party can see, like, do you want to win? Yes. Do you want to live in a better society? Yes. Okay. In order to have those two things happen, this is what you have to do. You're going to have to give up this only women and girls can be cared about, that only women and girls are oppressed by all men. That old model, just have to change it to everyone has problems. And we're going to help everyone. That's the shift that has to happen.
How is that controversial? Sorry. I mean, everyone talks about how controversial it is. Everyone has problems. Everyone's like, oh my God, you can't say that. Oh my goodness, no.
So if people can make that little mental shift, and and a lot of people do feel that way. I want to say that too. I've complained about the reaction. I've gotten support from a lot of women from my book, and I want to make that absolutely clear. I've got people from, people who are moderates, people who are far left, who also support my book. So I don't want to make it sound like, oh my gosh, there are no women who support this at all. There are a lot of women who support this. But the prevailing people at the top of the Democratic Party don't.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I feel there was also a massive awareness sort of thing. I mean, I feel like if you are very right, where men are behind women in every racial group in America in education, to the point where like a white man is now statistically less likely to go to college than a black woman, which will spin people's heads. If you told people that, they would get outraged. They would not only not believe you, but they'd be outraged and probably shout at you. But it's a fact, and men have been behind to get women in education for 30 years or more. I've done a research on this recently. Actually, they actually asked people in the UK about this, and they found out about 90% of people had no idea that men are behind women in education at university specifically. So surely before we start throwing out these policies, there needs to be like a slow drip, drip, drip of awareness raising campaign. So when we do announce affirmative action for men and boys in education and properly, it's not a shock to the system. It's like, this is a real problem. You all know about it. And this is a policy we're going to use. So do you think an awareness raising campaign as a prelude to any sort of presidential election, which is obviously in a long time now, is essential as well?
Absolutely. I mean, that has to be a huge part of it. The first thing is you measure the data and get the truth, and then you got to share that truth out with people so that they understand it and in a way that is digestible. It's very hard, to do that now with people's opinions are getting influenced by so many different platforms, so many different voices. There's a lot of, let me put it this way, there's not a lot of fact checking anymore. Stuff just gets out there, and it's hard to, it's just hard for anyone to separate the truth from what's going on. I've got one question for you, because this is something that I want to research more that I haven't yet. But I know that, one thing is for young men, a lot of men, there are certain trades that are very, popular among men: auto mechanic, HVAC, electrical, plumbing, those types of trades. And those can be jobs that pay really well that don't require a college degree. So I just wonder, there is this college gender. I've heard people mention, and they bring this up, and I think it's an interesting point. Well, maybe at least part of that gap, if not all of it, is because men opt for these other careers that are good careers, but they're not college careers. And I wonder how much of that is there. I suspect it's a much smaller number, but it would be something interesting to look at.
I think we do a great job in shaming those jobs in across the Western world. We seem to look down at blue collar jobs when we really shouldn't. I mean, the ironic thing is, if you were to sit down like a 14-year-old boy and show them the work of an electrician or an engineer or plumber, and then to show them the work of a lawyer, I reckon he would pick the electrician, plumber, or engineer, because it's just way more exciting. Both of those sets of jobs are going to pay roughly the same. Like, you get paid a fortune for being any of those. And it's like, at some point, we seem to look down at blue collar work, despite how much it's needed and important and highly paid it is. And I think that's just a universal issue, like sort of a smug middle class where we think we're too good for that. I mean, that's just a massive problem in the UK as well. I feel like I need to bring up the elephant in the room, though. And by elephant, it's like an orange elephant, more of like more of an orangutan, perhaps. And people bring this to me all the time, and it's a good point. Like, I didn't see really any policies from Donald Trump about men and boys. Like, you mentioned a few small things, but he wasn't banging the drum with like some sort of agenda. He doesn't care about boys and education or men's health, really. So
he said
why is he getting a free? He's not getting any criticism here. So what do you say to people like that?
So I agree that the Republicans aren't doing an amazing job at this, but they're doing a better job than Democrats, for sure. And let me give you a couple things first, just for Trump particular. When he was, when he was in office last time, his Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, they passed Title IX regulations. So this is a kind of a complicated issue, but long story short, Title IX was created in 1972, supplement to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You cannot discriminate on the basis of sex in any educational institution that receives federal funding. A federal student loan is considered federal funding. So basically, almost every single, other than a few small private schools, every college university has to not discriminate against men and women. Okay? And so then the question is, so that's very simple and very short. I mean, it's like, one sentence, right? That's the law. Since then, it's gotten very complicated. People have interpreted that in different ways. And this is where we get into some of the culture wars about, I'm not going to get into the whole definition of gender, but that is part of this Title IX debate. But there's another part of it where they have said any accusation of, sexual assault or harassment on campus is a Title IX violation, because it's assumed that was done because of the person's sex. So that is why this whole campus kangaroo court issue came up. So, and I'd say kangaroo court, that's kind of a loaded term, but let me say campus tribunal. So if you're a student or a faculty member or anyone, and you're accused of something, again, this applies to everyone. You have this campus tribunal, but it's so complicated. And just to give you an idea, in 2020, the regulations that Betsy DeVos put out was 2,000 pages. And then in 2024, this spring, Biden's administration, they changed it and they reversed a bunch of things. That was 1,500 pages. So if you're a Title IX administrator at a school, just in the last 4 years, you're sort of responsible for at least understanding 3,500 pages of regulations. That's a lot. Yeah, so anyway, but to go back to Trump and how does he support, men in this regard, at least the DeVos one, what they said was, everyone has a right to due process. And they just basically made they didn't get rid of the whole campus tribunal. They're saying it has to be fair. You have a right to know who your accuser is, what the charges are against you. You have a right to cross-examine. You have a right to defend yourself, basically. Due process was what our country was founded upon. It's one of the most important principles, back in, people left Europe when they thought, there's these kings and these monarchs who just throw people in the dungeon for no reason. We have no recourse. Like, no, we have law and order, but we have a right, we have a criminal justice system. We have all this stuff. It's an important part. So that's one really important way. Another thing that he said, and I'm not saying I 100% agree with how he could do this, but he did say, there's all these wars going around the world, and he said 500,000 young men have died in Ukraine, and this wouldn't have happened if I was president. Now, I don't know how we can make that assertion. So again, I'm not necessarily agreeing with the validity of his claims, but at least he was saying, "Hey, these young men are dying. Let's not do it. Let's create a world with less war." At least he's acknowledging that men die in war. I mean, that's, again, you might say that's not much, but it's something. I mean, when the other side's literally saying nothing, like that's something to grab onto, right?
I feel that's the thing about the due process and allegations as well. That's just something that people love to minimize. They love to minimize that as, again, that's just like being struck by lightning, false allegations. But I mean, today there's been a story in the news. A student at Oxford University in the UK, he's killed himself today after a whole campaign of cancel culture. It's not a stretch of the imagination to assume it's some sort of allegation of sexual violence, campaign of cancellation, and he killed himself. So I feel like what you talked about from Donald Trump is, and I hate to say it, sounds like good policy. If they're trying to make due process at university fairer, then I would vote for that.
Yeah, so, they're not saying we want to get rid of it altogether. I mean, everyone wants campuses to be safe for everyone, and that's a great goal. Of course, everyone wants that. The question is, how do you do it in a way that's fair? That's the challenge.
I think it's safe to say Donald Trump doesn't care much more about men and boys. I mean, I haven't seen a raft of positive policies for men and boys from the Republicans.
Yeah. I mean, just again, going back to the White House Gender Council. So that really started under Obama in 2008. Or 2009 rather. So he started, but his was more explicitly, it was White House Council for Women and Girls, very specifically. And again, when Biden came into office, he basically resurrected the same. So when Trump was in office the first time, he just got rid of the council. He just didn't have one, but he didn't have one for men and boys either. It's not like, when the Republicans come in, they have a men and boys council and they do everything they can for boys. And then as soon as they're done, now it switches back to girls. No, Trump just, I'm not doing this council thing. I don't need that. And he just didn't do anything. At least it's balanced. I mean, you could say you don't like the guy for a whole, other policy choices or whatever reason you don't like him, that's fine. But that was, at least that's balanced. And then Biden comes back in and, maybe they heard, I'm part of a group that, that Warren leads that have been trying to get a men's version of this council going. We wrote open letters to them. I wrote emails. I sent letters. I didn't get it. They never responded to me. I'm a tax-paying citizen. I know about these issues. I care about this stuff. You at least send me a letter, say, you know what, Mark, thank you for your interest in being a good American. But sorry, we're not going to focus. I mean, they could at least politely say no, but they don't even respond or anything. It's like,
didn't Barack ask our mutual friend Warren to set up some sort of White House commission on men and boys, and then that just evaporated?
No, what happened was, as far as what I understand, Warren was actually invited to be on the Women and Girls Council. He said, I'd actually rather start a Men and Boys Council. Can I get that? Can I put a proposal together? And then they said, yes, get a proposal together. And at the last second, say, actually, we don't want to hear the proposal. So
sounds about right.
I think we get locked in this Cartesian duality mentality. It's like us versus them, men versus women, Republican versus Democrats, this versus that. And then if you're on this team, then I'm on that team. If I'm on that team, then you're on this team. It's all this back and forth. Like, we need to just let that go and just say, women, like, okay, we're supporting you. We want to support your right to choose. We want to support all these other things. Let's just do it for men and boys too. And then we'll all be better off.
I agree. I just don't see that infighting on the right so much. I mean, I don't see women and men being divided on the right, but in the left, it's like a lot, especially like of the men, a lot of pointing and blaming for things they've not even done. Like it's very confusing. Like again, as a pro-choice man, I'm often told, no uterus, no opinion. I'm like, okay, that's fine. And then when women lose their rights, the same people asking, where are the men? But going back to what Donald hasn't done necessarily for men and boys, and it's true, he hasn't done a huge amount. What you're saying is like he doesn't campaign on sort of gender equality issues at all. Like he's just not interested. And if gender equality was an issue, social equality more broadly, that is sort of a left-wing issue in a way, right? It's not really
I would say that he does a little bit. He doesn't do it explicitly using the same language of the left. I think, we're talking a lot about social outcomes and this kind of stuff. I think he campaigns on it on a more gut level.
Okay.
And, because like I say, like this quote with Megyn Kelly the other day when she said, This guy's going to be the guy supporting men and boys. Like, they just put it right out there. They're like, I'm sure they have seen the same thing that I see and that a lot of other people see. Yeah, these guys they're just handing us half the electorate, like, to have an advantage with. Like, let's take it.
She said that whilst the Democrats are putting out this crazy campaign, I can't believe it wasn't satire, but they were basically saying men should vote Democrats because it will basically get them laid. They were talking about all these dating adverts where you'll be more dateable, you'll be more desirable to women if you vote for. I just can't believe if you put that idea through. I was like, that's the best you can do. Like, that's the reason what men are going to vote, so they get laid and are more successful with women. It's so insulting. And that's what Megyn Kelly, I think, was laughing at. That was the archetype of masculinity that the Democrats were selling. And I'm like, that's a pass for me. I wouldn't vote for that.
Yeah. I would say, one of my biggest takeaways from this election cycle and male voters. So there's one good and one bad. The good is men as voters were actually addressed significantly this year, by far more than any other election that I've ever followed. In 2020, I only found one commercial focused on men. In 2016, there were zero. The one I found in 2020 was from the Lincoln Project. It was simply called Men. And it was just the basic gist of the commercial was, be a man, admitted that voting for Trump was a mistake, and that's okay. A real man admits mistakes, vote for Biden. And it was a guy, I forget the actor's name, one of those actors with a deep, velvety voice. Yeah. Rural images of guys with pickup trucks and putting bales of hay on the truck and stuff, and it was just saying, like, yeah, Trump was bad. You can still be a man and vote. That was basically, and that was all. I was like, wow. I was excited when I jumped up off the couch. I'm like, they actually did a commercial for men. Oh my God, I've never even seen that before. This year, there were a ton of them. Yeah. There were a ton of them. And, we had the emergence of these groups, the White Dudes for Harris group. Some of these groups have existed before, but there's a Black Male Voter Project. There's a Black Men for Harris. There was much more visibility for men as a voting bloc. And so this is where that kind of man-washing thing comes in. And greenwashing is actually in some ways a good thing, because greenwashing can eventually lead to actual environmental improvements if you hold the country. Once they acknowledge that this is something they need to be held accountable for, then you can start to hold their feet to the fire. And in the same way, this year, the Democrats finally at least acknowledged that the male vote matters. They might not have. I don't think most of those commercials were extremely effective, in my opinion. I'll put it that way. But
it's very kind.
But at least they were focused. I mean, maybe this is an extremely low bar, but at least they address men and say, "Hey, men, we need your vote." There were a couple interesting things too that came in at the end. I don't know if you got these, and these were just done by individual, like small, very, very small political action committees. They were not Democratic Party things. One of them was putting ads on porn sites and saying, and it had a picture of Trump and Vance and said, "Project 25 wants to take away your porn. Enjoy it while you can." I'm like, that's good marketing. Like, you're talking, I mean, some people on the left don't like any porn at all. Porn could be, I'm not going to defend everything about porn. The other one was, I saw a meme about this, and I saw another ad about it, about men. If abortion is illegal and you accidentally you get someone pregnant, you're going to be on the hook for child support for 18 years. And, you can't get out of child support. I mean, they come after you. They come after your bank. They garnish your wages. They come after you. They don't care if you can't find a job. You're supposed to pay. And if you can't pay, you end up in jail, right? They take away your driver's license, your passport, and you get put in jail. We thought we got rid of debtor prisons in the U.S., but we still have them. We have them for child support. So anyway, I think those couple issues right at the end, again, which were not major Democratic points, but I thought those were two really good points. So anyway, that's my big takeaway. But that's the good takeaway. At least men were addressed. The bad takeaway is their core issues weren't really addressed. Like, we're talking about education, health, prison industrial complex. Like, a lot of these things weren't addressed, but at least men were addressed. So that's the huge positive I take out of this campaign.
I feel like, I take out the positive, that same positive. I've had that exact same thought process where I've lived a parallel life in the UK where men's issues were not talked about. The idea of a minister for men, which is what we're campaigning for in the UK, has been a joke until last year. and people are still laughing at it, but we're talking about it now. So I was weirdly enthused as well when I saw campaigns by Harris Waltz aimed at men, despite how poor they were. I mean, I'm gonna have a go at an American-based metaphor for you, but it's a bit like baseball, where like finally the batter steps up to the pitch, and the first swing of the ball, they completely fuck it up big time. But then the next swing of the ball, hopefully they can hit home run, but at least they're having a go. They're not like sitting out anymore. They've stepped up to the pitch, they messed it right up, but at least they gave it a go. And hopefully now Democrats can get their eye in and have another go in 4 years or whatever and get it right. And that's what we're all waiting for. And I just feel like you said, like, it's just going to come down to smart marketing. Like, the porn site's a strange one. You never get that in the UK. That is just politics in America is just mad. But I always think urinals, the poster for urinal, whenever you're taking a piss at urinal, you can't go anywhere. You're literally a captured audience. You're always looking straight ahead. You're not looking down. You're certainly not looking to the sides. So I'm like, put a bloody campaign right there about testicular cancer or like men's health more generally. Like, these are what I was missing. And I would love to help the Democrats do that sort of thing. And I think you're even more qualified. So what does the future look like? Do you think they will change? Is this a part of a change now? Are we past the worst of it? Are they going to hit a home run next time, do you think? Or something at least a little bit better?
I think it will be better. I really hope it is. I mean, you've lost the White House. Like I said, you've lost White House, you've lost Senate, you lost Supreme Court. And, in my book, I kind of let's look at the next 4 election cycles. And the first of those 4 is done. And I have a good case scenario, bad case scenario. And I use those same 2 data points, like the men and the women and how much are they voting for each party. And we went straight to the bad case scenario. The Democrats did. They went to the scenario where they lost men by, in fact, I even, on my just hypothetical graph, I think I had them at about -11, which is pretty much right where they were. I said, this would be, if you don't do what I suggest, you're probably going to end up here. And that's exactly what happened. So I'm hoping that they can say, oh, you know what? Yeah, let's just focus better on, men and boys. Let's just get this number up. I mean, the farther up you get it, the less, you still, of course, are going to continue support for women to grow. I have to say that repeatedly, but I just do just for clarity. But it also means you have a little bit of wiggle room. So for instance, this election, women didn't vote as much Democrat as they had hoped. They thought it was going to be +14 or something, or maybe even +15 or 16. But no, it's only early records are showing about +10. It might be a little higher when they're done, but somewhere about that. So, but there's no wiggle room. You can't do a campaign like, we're going to assume that we get the absolute best case scenario among the women voters. Therefore, we don't have to care about men at all. That's what they did in 1984. They lost. That's what they did in 2016. They lost. And then I wrote in my book, I'm worried they're going to be repeating 1984 and 1926. And that's exactly what happened.
So if I'd asked you this time last week, who's going to win, you would have predicted this.
So you know what? I gotta be honest, because most of this year I was saying Trump is going to win. Democrats have no chance. In this last little rush, and in looking at the data, there was that Washington poll gender tracker was at -8.7. I'm like, oh, that's within the margin of error. And then I thought, what? I think women might be really strong. They might, if it's at 8 or 9, I think it's still a possibility. Like, Democrats could win if it's like 8 to 9. Like, it's going to be really close. I said, I guess it could be super, super, super close, but I think the Democrats could just maybe pull it off but I was wrong. I think that was a little bit of hopeful thinking on my part too. But also, I do say this about the -8%. It's not a prediction, and I'm not a predictor. I'm not like the Lichtman guy who has his 13 keys. I predict this will happen. I just think of it as an indicator, and I think it's a good goal to set for Democrats. I think the Democrats should say, look, we have a goal at -4 or break even. Why not just say we're going to try to break even among men? That's going to be our goal. What can we do to get there? And then they'll have a better chance of winning.
I'm joining you in the hopeful sort of vision forwards, and I'm imagining, let's say in 6 months' time, or tomorrow, let's say, you get a phone call from the Democratic Party or whoever's running for president. Like, what advice, what key points do you give them? Like, give me that 1, 2, 3 advice. I know you've thought about it, but I'd love to know what it is.
Yeah. Number one, understand the issues yourself. Like whoever is running things, they have to really deeply and fully understand the issues. Number two, do a listening tour around the country to men of all things and really understand these issues even better. And then number three, develop your party platform and your principles along those bases. Number four, then send that out to everyone, every state, every representative, every single look. There are thousands of websites between the Democratic Party, state level, county, city, and every Democratic representative and every Democratic candidate in the country. Every single one of those sites should talk about men and boys issues and show that this party cares about men and boys. Every single one. Just think how massively that would sea shift this whole thing, right? And that doesn't take any remarkable change of values because, like I say, a lot of the things that support men and boys are already consistent with the democratic values. It's just that balance, that shift in balance. So if they do those things just to start right there, that would be another. And then another thing I would do is in every locality where there's a commission for women and girls, have a commission on men and boys too. Or if you don't want to have one for anyone because you're a small town, you don't do that. Great, then don't do it. I'm not saying everyone needs to do this, but if you're spending, like San Francisco has a department on the status of women and girls. This year, the budget I think was $13 million.
Wow.
Again, that was created 50 years ago when the world was a different place. Gender roles were in flux, and things were different then. I get it. That's totally fine. I'm not saying to get rid of that department. I'm saying let's have a balancing department for men and boys.
Well, hasn't Washington State been trying to set up a commission for men and boys, the first state-based commission, and it's failed, I think, at least once. So
it's failed for a couple of years, but they're still working on it. They're doing a great job. Yeah, Blair Daly and WIBM, they're doing a great job up there. We tried this too in California about 5 years ago. Actually, Warren and I and another guy, Sean Kuhlman, the three of us. He's with a nonpartisan. I always like to be clear because a lot of times people, the issues for men and boys also are just nonpartisan issues. Like everyone should care about male well-being. But anyway, we tried that in California. And California is so complicated. I mean, it's like a country. I think if it were a country, it would have the 5th largest GDP in the world or something. So you can just imagine all the special interests that you're competing with. Tom Golden is a guy who's worked in, I believe it was the state of Maryland, to create a men's health commission, and they did some health reports, and then that just kind of didn't go anywhere. Jack Kammer is a guy in Baltimore, Maryland, who had created a Baltimore City commission. There was recently one in Prince George's County, Maryland, that lasted for about a year, a commission on men, boys, and fathers. That seems to have kind of fizzled out. I haven't heard anything. So there have been these attempts to do this, and I wonder, why are these not succeeding? Because people are trying. There are people who've been trying for 40 years. People have been trying to do this. So why is it not happening? I think there's two things. Number one, they have to be created by statute and funded. So, like as I mentioned, the Department on the Status of Women and Girls in San Francisco, $13 million annual budget. The California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls, $9 million annual budget. Well, they're going to do something with that. Well, you get $9 million. If you and I had $9 million to start a commission, I bet we could do some pretty good things with that. So it's created by statute so that it's permanent, and then it's funded so that they have people whose full-time job are getting paid to work on it, right? That's the sort of thing you need. And then the second thing is the mentality just needs to shift. And I guess that's kind of a recurring theme in our talk today. It's just like this kind of shift needs to take place. And maybe this election will be the thing that allows that shift to happen on the political left.
I'm not even sure if a shift is the right word. I just think make consistent democratic policies. Like you wouldn't accept any of these outcomes for any other group, but somehow we seem to accept them for men. So it's more about not even shifting, keep it the same, but make it consistent. I think. I mean, if I may add some departments of my own. I've always, obviously, at least one office for men's health would be a pretty good start.
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
Looked at the Women's Bureau, which is a part of the Department of Labour. I'm sure you know. Looks after the welfare and safety of women at work. Considering men's unemployment and considering how many men die at work, 95% of all workplace deaths being men, I'm like, there needs to be a men's bureau too to do the same. Similar as an office on violence against women. That's very important. Keep that, but I don't know why there isn't one for men, considering they're the main victim for most violent crimes. And also, it's not a government department, but the National Coalition for Women and Girls in Education exists to get women and girls in education. I don't know why a similar group doesn't exist. Similar coalition doesn't exist for men and boys. So those are policies I'd love to see. Whether or not they're too hot, I don't know. They shouldn't be.
Yeah. I think that it comes down to institutional balance. All of these things. We're talking about commissions, or in the United States, we have something called WANTO, Women Apprenticeships and Non-Traditional Occupations, and this kind of came from Rosie the Riveter, World War II. It's like, hey, let's get women in the workplace, and let's support that. But now things have shifted. And again, we're in a new time, and we're going away from certain industries into new industries. So I suggested something called MENTO, men entering non-traditional occupations. So that could be either a new occupation that didn't exist before. It could be other occupations like teachers, probably the most obvious one, where just like there's so few male teachers now. Like that's something a lot of people have been calling for, to get more male teachers. So that's again, and you're right, like domestic violence, like we have the Violence Against Women Act that would, by the way, named by then Senator Joe Biden, right? So he's the one who did that. So there were some groups in the U.S. who did get some gender neutral language in there, and I think about 2012 or so. So there is actually some, if you read the fine print, it still is technically supposed to be gender neutral, that act. But let's change the name of it. Let's call it the Family Violence Prevention Act, or the Domestic Violence Prevention Act, or something. If words matter, there was actually there were a couple of congresspeople who had a bill together to make language gender neutral, but only in instances when women were excluded. Yeah. So if you exclude the men, you can keep the words, but if you exclude the women, you have to change it to be gender neutral. And it's like, okay, how much more plainly can you see the bias? Yeah,
I've seen that from UN Women, which is like the UN, the women's version of the UN, and they'll put out a literal tweet saying the importance of gender neutral language. Police officer, firefighter, chairperson. I'm like, excellent. But then like the following week, they put up a tweet about mansplaining and explaining what mansplaining means. And I'm like, I go back 1 week, I can see you talking about gender neutral language, and I go forwards 1 week, and you're talking about mansplaining. They're telling people about man-interruption, which is just a man interrupting it. And yeah, I would love to see that order's completely wiped away. That'd be excellent. But I mean, the violence against women, gender neutral stuff. I mean, I would vote for that, to make it gender neutral today. But put that way down the controversy thing. That is one of the very last demons you have to slay, I think. So just broadening it out before we end, Mark, because this isn't just happening in America. There is positive progress, politically speaking, happening in other countries. I know we're talking a little bit about a men's health strategy in the UK. Wes Streeting, our Minister for Health, he hasn't actually done it. He just said he would, but that's better than not saying anything. So talk is cheap in politics, and he hasn't delivered on any of it. But what would you say to other countries that are seeing similar changes? And do you think this is something to sort of be positive about?
So this is an international issue, and each country has some unique things that make it special and make it different. And cultures vary around the world, but there are a lot of issues in every country, even countries you think that and I'll also say this. Let me add this other point. If there's a country where women's rights are particularly not observed, there's probably the same thing true for men in that country too. There's probably you'll probably see human rights, because all men's rights and women's rights are all just human rights. I just think there's more and more awareness coming. There's more stories that come out. I think sometimes these viral stories are important, even though they seem kind of crazy. But several instances, I know there's one in Spain where these people in the Spanish military were changing their gender because they got better benefits if they were female. So I say, oh, I guess I'm changing to female, but I get to retire earlier and get better benefits. And similarly in South America, I think it was Peru, I forget which country, but in one of the countries in South America, a guy changed his gender so he could get 50-50 support with his kids.
I saw that. I would do that 100%. If that's going to give much, I'll do that.
So, you see these, it's like, oh, maybe family court's an issue. I have a funny family court, well, not funny, but interesting family court story. Back when I was in New York, I was asked to go with a friend of a friend to family court because in a previous time that he had gone to family court, there was an issue. Anyway, so I go to family court with him, and it really, just seeing how the family courts operate just made me very, it was crazy. They just make snap decisions that can totally change your life with very little input, and with what seemed to me, as a casual observer, I had not been there for the whole length of this thing, but just, casually, it just seemed to me that this court seemed, kind of biased. And a lot of men feel that they are biased. So that would be something, it would be great. But they're not brand new issues either. These issues have been around for a long time. There have been a lot of people doing work on these issues, writing about them, and working on them, working in small groups. Some men just decide, I don't want to try to do a macro thing, I'm going to do a micro thing, and they have men's groups. They work with individuals. But there's a lot of people who have really dedicated their lives to this for decades. So that is another thing that gives me some hope. Is that, it's not just, some people quickly just realize this issue. No, these issues have been known for decades. People, there've been a lot of great researchers, writers, counselors, those kinds of people who've been doing a ton of great work on this stuff. So now it's just time to take it to the next level, I think.
I agreed. I mean, just again, education. I mean, boy's been behind my entire life, like 35 years more or less, and it's not a new thing. And I'm share your enthusiasm. I'm glad to see them talked about, perhaps not talked about in the right way or in the way I would do it, but at least there's an effort, and even a well-meaning effort, perhaps at that. So that's a very positive way to end it. But I would just love to know a little bit more about your book. Where do we buy it? How do we find out more?
All right.
Let's see it. There it is.
All right.
I mean, that is the most personally titled book anywhere in the world right now. Like, surely that is what a title.
Yeah, How Democrats Can Win Back Men. And I have sent this to the party. It's available on Amazon. That's just the easiest way to get it. So it'll be on Amazon.com or UK or whichever Amazon is you're on. How Democrats Can Win Back Men. And by the way, the subtitle of the book is Why Understanding Male Voters and Their Issues is Vital for Democratic Victory. So again, this gets into that you want to win, but you have to understand what are the real male issues, and you have to actually create policies that support them on that basis. Then they will see, then the imaging stuff will work because you backed it up with the policy.
And can we get some sort of discount code for the next Democrat presidential candidate, just to get it into there?
I'll send it to him for free. Yeah, anyone who's running for president ever for the rest of my life, you get a free book. Yeah, discount
code. You can win 2028. Is it
2028? Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. All right. Well, honestly, Mark, it's been so lovely. One of the things I love doing about podcasts is just talking to people for my own sake. But I just like giving people a space to chat and to see all these perfectly lovely, normal guys. And you seem great. I really enjoyed talking to you. And I think just by chatting so publicly, we're sort of destigmatizing these issues too, by showing us as compassionate, progressive, democratic men. So thank you so much. And I'll put a link to your book and everything else. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. Bye.